All right, why don't we get started? Welcome, everybody. My name is Gabe Scheinman. I'm the Executive Director of the Alexander Hamilton Society. It's great to have so many people with us today. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, which I hope aren't too many, we are the Alexander Hamilton Society is a nonpartisan, not-for-profit national organization that seeks to identify, educate, and launch young men and women into the foreign policy and national security worlds, imbued with the Hamiltonian perspective of strong and principled American leadership in global affairs. We operate first and foremost on college campuses across the country, where our student-led chapters host some of our nation's most eminent scholars and practitioners. And our over 50 chapters host nearly 200 events a year on campuses, and nearly 1,000 alumni are serving across the national security and foreign policy space. If you're interested in learning more about what we do or getting involved with us, you can visit us at alexanderhamiltonsociety.org, and we'd love to connect with you. So now, with that disclaimer aside, let me actually go to today's event. So it's a great pleasure to welcome David Albright, who's with me here virtually. David is a physicist, is founder and president of the nonprofit Institute for Science and International Security. That's ISIS, and at some point he'll tell us the story. Maybe he actually had to clearly change that into the good ISIS as opposed to the bad ISIS. And in fact, if you look on the cover of the book, it's by him, a colleague, and the rest of the good ISIS team. So you've clearly branded that moniker, I think, really successfully. David is a nuclear and non-proliferation expert, having spent 30 years assessing secret nuclear programs. He's testified numerous times on nuclear issues before the US Congress and advised many governments. He's the author of 9 books, and he's here to discuss his latest book on Iran's nuclear program, titled Iran's Perilous Pursuit of Nuclear Weapons, published with his colleague and co-author Sarah Burkhard and the rest of, as I said, what he calls the good ISIS team. Before I begin, as always, we'll have time at the end for all of you to ask questions. To do that, please submit your questions through the Q&A function in the dashboard at the bottom, on the bottom right. And when we turn to that time in the program, I'll call on you and figuratively hand you the mic, i.e. unmute you for you to ask your question in that vein. So with that, why don't we actually get into it? So David, your book, Chronicles, really in probably the most in-depth way out there, the Islamic Republic of Iran's efforts to build nuclear weapons. And the book draws from a lot of actually original Iranian documents seized in a really daring operation that probably should be a movie by now, but seized by Israel's Mossad in 2018, a little over 3 years ago, in a dramatic overnight raid in Tehran. And the nuclear archive, as what became known, the archive, really allows us, Americans, lay people, a much better insight into the country's effort to secretly build nuclear weapons. And we'll get into it. The book relies really on unprecedented access to the archive, many of which actually translated into English for the first time. And the way you structure the book, it really has 2 parts. So the first part is kind of before 2003, when Iran had a crashed nuclear weapons program, tried to build a handful of nuclear weapons, and the beginnings, maybe not the beginnings, but the infrastructure of an industrial complex to produce many more. Some things happened in 2003, and we'll get into that. But and then the rest of the book is really on its nuclear past post 2003, about how it kept up some of its nuclear weapons work, and primarily focused on establishing capabilities to make weapon-grade uranium, as well as developing more reliable, longer-range ballistic missiles program. So what I want to start really with here, which is maybe you can explain for everybody here, what exactly is the nuclear archive that the Israelis spirited away a couple years ago? And how does this relate to, frankly, the way you structured the book, which is sort of this pre-2003 status of the Iranian nuclear program, and then this post-2003 status of the program?
Yeah, any nuclear weapons program is going to have a lot of documentation, because there's a lot of research and development activities that have to go on, a lot of testing, and also a lot of planning, because it involves thousands of people in very technical fields. And so there's in any nuclear weapons program, there's always a lot of documents. And Iran at one point, largely probably thinking it was better concealing the documents, decided to gather them together and put them in one location. And the Israelis learned about that after this nuclear deal was implemented, and started to watch that site. And at one point, the Iranians moved the documents. They're in vaults, kind of very elaborate file cabinets that are like a vault, and and in shipping containers, on vehicles, truck beds that could be moved quickly. And so they, at one point, moved them to a new location. And one can speculate that's part of their security, is don't leave anything too long at one place. The Israelis decided to go in and seize these documents, and they were able to, in one night, break into 6 of these vaults out of a total of 30, and take away about 20% of the documentation in the archive, plus an unexpected find of a large collection of computer disks. And so that collection ended up back in Israel, and that's what part of which we had access to, and were able to draw upon it to write our book. And we didn't access the classified nuclear weapons design information. There's quite a bit of classified, highly sensitive information, because it is a nuclear weapons program. And so we didn't access all of it, but we had considerable access so that we could draw a picture of what that nuclear weapons program was like.
And so how did, I mean, maybe it's a question of how much access you had or what percentage you've had access to. Maybe that's not quite the right way to think about it, but how did what you saw, and you know, I'm a layperson, a lot of us don't know a lot about nuclear weapons, you know a lot. What is it that you saw that that gave you a different picture, or what did you particularly learn that you didn't know before having access to those things?
We've at my institute studied many nuclear weapons programs, including the United States nuclear weapons program, and what intrigued me in this collection was the great amount of detail about how they were going to design nuclear weapons, how they were going to integrate the theoretical with the experimental, which is always a good sign if you want to build nuclear weapons, how they wanted to build an entire production complex to be able initially to make 5 nuclear weapons, but then to be able to make many more. And so it was a very robust effort. And I think just as interesting to me was that they didn't build them. And the dates of the documentation discussing the Iranian discussions on why of not building them correlate exactly with the US presence in Afghanistan and the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. That pressure forced the Iranians to reevaluate and to decide that it was too risky to build nuclear weapons, that in a sense, Iraq got invaded when the evidence of WMD or nuclear weapons was really sketchy. I mean, my Lord, Iran had a full-blown nuclear weapons program. So it, I think, took it to heart that it had a real problem. And so it decided to not build, I think, to delay. In the documentation, there's also interesting information about how they plan to continue their nuclear weapons program into the future. And that is what you allude to as part 2 of our book, that set that up perfectly, that what did they do?
And I know it's a counterfactual, so obviously it's hard to answer, but if what I understand from your analysis of what you saw, that absent, let's say, the American invasion of Iraq in March 2003, you think that the Iranians would have not delayed or submerged their program, but they would have continued, and in some ways this day of reckoning that many might be worried about actually would have been a lot sooner?
I think so. I mean, I think there was knowledge of Iran's nuclear weapons program. Intelligence agencies in the West knew about it. The International Atomic Energy Agency was learning about it, but not much was being done. And it was kind of a collection of events, and some of which we were involved in at my institute, of heightened awareness of this secret nuclear program in Iran. And that coincided with the invasion of Iraq, and in the naming of the Iran in the Rogues Gallery in 2002, 2003. And so Iran understood that it was in the bullseye of the United States, and so it took steps to walk back what it was doing, but not to give it up.
And how would you compare, because clearly what you're saying is we didn't realize it at the time, but how would you compare the Iranian nuclear weapons program in 2002, 2003, compared to what we thought we knew of the Iraqi program at the time, right? And we later, maybe found out that it wasn't as developed as we thought it was, to say the least. But I'm wondering if you could compare for us the two situations at the time, based on what we know now.
Well, I was involved in my institute was involved in challenging the Bush administration claims in the fall of 2002 on the nuclear weapons program. We weren't pure. We thought maybe there was a little one there, but we didn't think there was a big one. And it certainly could be handled by inspections and diplomatic pressure. At the same time, we were getting reports of secret Iranian nuclear sites. And so in Iraq, people were arguing over, if you remember, aluminum tubes, not centrifuges, but aluminum tubes that could be made into centrifuges, and kind of odd statements by Iraqi officials alluding to maybe they want nuclear weapons. What you had in Iran was big facilities, massive underground sites, one of which we revealed through satellite imagery in December 2002 and identified it as a uranium enrichment plant. In Iraq, there were claims they were building a uranium enrichment plant, or maybe even had one, but no evidence of that. And yet in Iran, in the same period of time, they had big facilities, big hidden nuclear sites. And so at the time, we were very frustrated. We thought that the international effort was focused on the wrong country. Not that we wanted to invade Iran, but that we thought that the focus should be greatly diminished on Iraq, and put on Iran.
So let's use that as an opportunity to transition a little bit to the international focus, as you kind of put it. So, I think for the lay people, then Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel goes on TV, makes a pretty dramatic presentation. I think it was in January or February of 2018. I'm trying to remember. At that point, the United States is still in the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Agreement, in the Iran deal. And later the Trump administration takes it out. But the results of the Israeli operation in the press and sort of the mainstream were really dismissed by many at the time. This is referring to old material. This is a long time ago. We already knew about it. It doesn't change anything. Obviously, what you're saying is not exactly the case. But from where you sit, what are the actual impact of the discovery of the archive on the international focus? How has the revelations from that impacted, let's say, the IAEA and the inspections, the positions of the P5+1, the parties to the nuclear deal? What in your mind do you see, and part of it I'm sure will be out of your book as it gets more read, but what in your mind are the actual impact, let's say, of the revelations of the archive?
Yeah, and one thing, I didn't understand why the U.S., some parts of the U.S. communities were so dismissive of what Prime Minister Netanyahu was presenting. I mean, I would have expected an open mind. I mean, and some of that may be biased, that we seek out secret nuclear weapons archives or information, and as I said, in many countries, and have done books on those programs, South Africa, Taiwan, and these documents are always the heart or the personal stories from the nuclear weapon years. So I thought at least there'd be an open mind, and so I was a little surprised that the information was just dismissed, because and just on the surface it seemed like there was new material there. As we dove into it, there was a lot of new material. And half the sites, I mean, we came up with a list. Let me step back. We came up with a list of 20 sites, let's say, key to the Ahmad plan. Half of those facilities, let me not call them sites, half of those facilities were unknown before the archive. There were lots of information unknown about the ability of Iran to build nuclear weapons. They're more advanced than was known. And so I would have at least expected an open mind, but I think it reflects just kind of the poisonous atmosphere that surrounds the nuclear deal, and that leads people to cherry pick information, live in silos, and if that information isn't in the silo or helpful to the silo, they try to rebut it. Now, that being said, not everyone is like that. And so I think if you look more internationally, if you pick the International Atomic Energy Agency, Israel made a decision to go public with this archive. It could have, as an intelligence agency, the Mossad could have just held it, used it selectively. They made a decision in line, or with, let me say this, the prime minister made a decision and Mossad went along with it to make it public. Making it public meant giving the entire set to the International Atomic Energy Agency, which pored over it, studied it, and used it to go after Iran's deception about its activities. It focused on a few sites that are talked about in the documentation and used it to insist on inspections, got Iran under pressure, allowed it. Once the IAEA was able to take environmental samples, they were able to find traces of undeclared uranium. And so they were able to establish that Iran has undeclared uranium. It's a major violation of its safeguards agreements that derive from the Non-Proliferation Treaty. All of this is a violation of the JCPOA, or the nuclear deal. And so here you had an international body, greatly respected, using the archive to develop new information about Iran and show that there's a real problem, that Iran does not have a peaceful nuclear program, or at least the international inspectors can't establish that and are raising real questions about that. I think intelligence agencies around the world have used this information to hone their skills about what's going on now. The archive is just littered with the names of people and spelled. And again, it's always a challenge when you're dealing with a foreign language, particularly a language like Farsi, to transliterate the names into, let's say, English script. And there can be great differences in the transliterations. The archive has the names in Farsi, it has their ID numbers, it has their degrees, the information about their parents. And so you can use that to track where are those people today. And so you can use the information in the archive to move forward in time to try to figure out what's happening. One of the statements by the Israelis, and I must say we received documentation which we translated. Israelis translate from Farsi to Hebrew, and sometimes English. We translated Farsi to English, but we also received briefings from the Israelis, many briefings, where we could discuss the archive in more detailed or different ways. I mean, we can't get access. I gave an example. We can't get access to the classified nuclear weapons data, but we can ask questions about it and have it described to us. And they can decide at what level of detail they want to provide that information. And so we had quite a bit of description of what was going on in the archive, and that helped us, and it helped intelligence agencies figure out what's going on. And one of the findings by the Israelis is that many of the people who worked in the Samad plan pre-2003 work in follow-on organizations that sure look like they're developed, that at least a part of the mission is devoted to maintaining nuclear weaponization capabilities, the ability to make the bomb itself. That in that sense, the people have tended to stay together over time in a organization. The names change, but there seems to be an underlying mission that we assess is aimed at being able to build nuclear weapons, if so ordered.
And so I understand the political reasons, let's say, why a lot of governments put their heads in the sand, but when you brief foreign governments, when you brief members of Congress and their offices, when you brief maybe even intelligence agencies, and as you just said just now pretty clearly, there's a litany of things that are not only violations of the NPT, but also violations of the JCPOA. What's their response?
Well, I think it depends. I mean, certainly the Trump administration welcomed it, and I think in the United States, the entire archive has been declared secret. It's very hard to have a two-way discussion with a U.S. official about the archive, but they certainly listen and they welcomed discussion of the archive. The Biden administration, I think, certainly is more restrained in what it says, but some of the people that are involved in the Biden administration, I know, certainly understand the value of the archive and its importance. They didn't dismiss it. Um, Internationally, there's a lot of interest. I mean, I said Israel shared it with the International Atomic Energy Agency in its entirety. It shared it with France and Britain and the United States in its entirety. Um, Most states didn't get anything. And we've been the conduit for many states to learn about the archive. And you see that in briefings. Um, for example, a briefing Ali Hainon and I did in Vienna a while back. There were 60 representatives of 60 missions in Vienna who came to hear it and were extremely interested. And there were many ambassadors there, and many senior level staff members of the missions, and they were very anxious to hear what was in the archive. And if you're a country like the UAE or Saudi Arabia, you're very nervous about what's in the archive, and all these nations want to try to have a policy that's based in reality. And I think you can't do that anymore without understanding the basics about the archive.
In your mind, I mean, the archive was or announced, its existence was announced publicly in 2018. Had this happened a few years earlier, had this Israeli operation happened in 2013 or 14 or 15, i.e. when the negotiations, both for what was then the interim deal and then ultimately the JCPOA were ongoing, what impact do you think that would have had on the negotiations? What would the United States, the P5+1 team have had to have reckoned with if there was the discovery of this archive just during the negotiations?
I think one thing that would have certainly happened is there'd been a lot more focus on these undeclared military nuclear activities. I mean, one of the problems prior to 2015 was, there certainly was information about the Iranian nuclear weapons program, some very detailed, but overall, it hardly compares at all to what's in the archive. And so if you have the archive, you can very surgically ask or insist to go to certain sites, and you know what happened. You know who to ask because their names are on the reports, and you know what they did. You know the whole layout of the nuclear weapons research, development, and production operation. And so I think if this archive had been available prior to 2015, there would have been a much more greater emphasis on pressuring Iran to reveal its program, admit it had a nuclear weapons program. I mean, it can hold back some, but to reveal the basics and to allow the international inspectors to verify that Iran's declaration is complete. That in a way, it's a sin to have had a nuclear weapons program. There's no doubt about it for a country like Iran. Same with South Africa. But if they give it up and cooperate with inspectors, then they should expect a reward. And I think that process could have possibly happened if we'd had the archive prior to 2015. And we'd be today in a much more secure place. That, there'd be discussions of limiting Iran's nuclear capabilities, but there would be much greater confidence that they didn't have a nuclear weapons program in their back pocket, ready to go on short order to build nuclear weapons or to build a nuclear explosive device even quicker that they could detonate underground. And if they detonate one underground, it'll shift the Middle East fundamentally.
So that's a great way to transition. Let's talk about today. In many ways, the bulk of the second half of your book really is kind of dealing with the last 5 or 6 years in these ways. What is the current status of the Iranian nuclear weapons program? What do you see? What do we know? What is your sense of how the Biden administration knows and sees it as literally as of this moment?
Well, again, I don't have access to U.S. assessments, and they're very sparse, and you have to. And I think if you take them literally, they're very misleading. What we assessed as our team is that the program continued. The International Atomic Energy Agency actually developed some information about its continuation. There's other information in the open sources developed by the media. And so we see a program that continued. But in 2003, it didn't have the ability to make weapon-grade uranium. Its enrichment program was just beginning. It had a secret enrichment site under the Ahmad plan. We think that continued, and that's what Fordow is, this secret, this deeply buried enrichment site that was revealed to the world in 2009. So what they've done since '03 on the weapon grade uranium side is they've gone from not being able to make any to being able to make it if they wanted to. They could break out and make weapon grade uranium relatively quickly now, within a matter of a few months, enough for a bomb. And on the weaponization side in 2003, the documents show in the archive, they had some bottlenecks. Some of that work was done after '03, and it's documented what it was by the International Atomic Energy Agency. Some work, we're not sure if it was done, but could be done relatively quickly. That we think, given Iran's ability to hide things, that there's probably secrets about the bomb program we don't know about. And so we think today, if they wanted to build nuclear weapons, if they broke out, they'd probably first try to test a nuclear weapon. They could do that, we think, within 6 to 9 months. If they wanted to put one on a missile and have it be reliable, probably take them a little longer. There were some issues unresolved in '03 on mounting a warhead on a reentry vehicle that are documented in the archive. And so maybe it takes them a year or 2 years to have reliable warheads on ballistic missiles. Now, all that is quick. I mean, that's the problem. And particularly if the goal is to test a device underground, that all this could happen before the international community could really mount a response. And one of the things that's very risky today, it's kind of under the table a little bit, is that Iran is denying access to the inspectors. They're hiding or withholding information. They appear to be practicing breakout. They're not doing it, but they appear to be practicing it. And so they could be reducing the time to be able to conduct a test or build a nuclear weapon. And so I think that's one of the risks we're facing today, and it's not being dealt with very well. And but that has to be a priority in these negotiations of how do you take a program that is close to being able to have nuclear weapons and either drive them further away in terms of time needed to complete a bomb, or how do you increase the transparency that you can discover it quicker, or how do you increase the pressure so that Iran starts to back away from having this kind of nuclear weapons program? And I would argue that the last one is the most important to fight for right now. It's probably the one that is least important to the Biden administration.
So just a reminder, if you have questions, you can submit them through the Q&A function, and we'll get to them in a bit. So let me kind of drill in on the last couple sentences you just made. Putting aside the more, let's say, fantastical arguments of what people who supported the JCPOA said, which is that it would block all pathways to a bomb and dismantle this, that, and the other. But maybe a more honest assessment is that it could constrain and or delay the progress of some of its programs, or the growth or the speed of some of its programs. Now looking back, that we have nearly, I think it was the deal was never signed, but agreed to in, I think, end of July 6 years ago. So now we're 6 years later. What is your assessment of how the JCPOA has done, how the agreement has done, and at least doing that part, and at least slowing or constraining or putting some sort of limits on the key elements of its nuclear weapons program?
Well, a nuclear weapon has 3 pillars, we call it. There's the pillar to make the weapon grade uranium in Iran. There's a pillar to make the nuclear weapon itself, we call nuclear weaponization, and there's delivery, which is ballistic missiles in the case of Iran. On the weapon grade uranium pillar, the JCPOA put constraints. It didn't knock down the pillar by any means. That would be equivalent to saying you'd have no enrichment or no reprocessing in Iran. Its weakness was that those limits expire after 10 to 15 years. And so at that point, the pillar at 2030, for example, would actually be stronger than it was in 2015. The weaponization, the JCPOA effectively has done very little to constrain the program. There is something called Section T that could help on that, but it gets at the bans on nuclear weaponization activities, but it hasn't been enforced or verified in any way. And so overall, on the weaponization, little has been done. And just to bring in, something else, part of the reason Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, the father of the nuclear weapons program, we call him the Leslie Groves of the nuclear weapons program, was killed, was probably frustration over that the JCPOA did so little on constraining Iran's nuclear weaponization activities. And then the third one hasn't been touched at all, the ballistic missile. There are some restraints in UN Security Council Resolution 2231 on missiles. Iran essentially ignores those. So it's a mixed bag, and you don't have a warm feeling that this will end well if Iran continues on its current trajectory and just lives out the JCPOA.
Well, let's turn to that. So the Biden administration, right? I mean, it campaigned on it, is attempting to return the United States to the JCPOA, to the Iran deal, and is engaged in, I think it's 6 rounds of indirect negotiations, and 7th maybe forthcoming with the Iranians on it. And while it's a little bit more complicated than the way I'm making out to be, essentially they're seeking I think like a return to the status quo ante. I mean, you might decide it's something different, but something like compliance for the compliance, which is if the Iranians get back into compliance, and you just talked about how that may never have been the case in the first place, but get back to compliance with what the terms of the deal was, the United States get back into compliance in terms of the sanctions relief and other things, that's the deal. Most of the reporting has focused on what that means for the sanctions regime, the American and international sanctions regime. What about entities that were now sanctioned under different authorities than they were originally, let's say, as part of the deal? What about things that have development or behavior that has developed since then? Less of the reporting is focused on what does it actually mean for the program, i.e., what has changed about the Iranian program now compared to where it was in 2015 or where it was, let's say, when the Trump administration has exited the deal in 2018. Can you kind of lay out for us what is the delta, and what, in terms of the Iranian program itself, in that time frame, and what impact might that have on the Iranian willingness or ability or possibility even to go back to the deal?
Yeah, there's a real risk that from that perspective, what you end up with is something weaker than the JCPOA in 2016 when it was implemented early January 2016. Iran's taken many steps that are not reversible, and you have to have you have to take some action to compensate for that. And for example, they've deployed advanced centrifuges. Let's say one is called the IR6. It's many times more powerful than the IR1s, which are the ones that continue to operate under the JCPOA. One way to proceed is those centrifuges are all just destroyed. Iran has refused to do that so far. Their position is they don't destroy any nuclear equipment or materials. And so, let me correct that. Not destroy any equipment. They'll blend down low or enriched uranium, 20%, for example, down to natural, or ship it out of the country. But on equipment, centrifuges in particular, they won't destroy them, and that was a firm position. I think the U.S. has to insist that these centrifuges be destroyed. They weren't supposed to be there under the JCPOA. Later, yes, but not now. And so if they're just stored, mothballed, then you have a weaker JCPOA. And I think that's a problem for the United States. Iran went ahead and started making uranium metal. Now, uranium metal is a critical step for making a core of a nuclear weapon. And the JCPOA bans its production, in fact, bans its research or production for at least 15 years. And Iran's gone ahead and started to make it. How do you reverse that? You throw away the uranium metal. It's small quantities, but now Iran's gained experience in making it, and it's produce 60% enriched uranium in an innovative way, in a way that is an advancement from where it was at in 2015. How do you get rid of that advancement? It's in their brains. So something has to be done to compensate for these advancements that cannot be erased. And again, a simple way of doing it would be to insist that certain sanctions remain. Other ways to do it, and the IAEA Director General Grossi's pointed at it, is there has to be additional verification. And I would argue the verification has to bore deeper into the question of whether it has a nuclear weapons program, or is the way the IAEA would ask it, is it a peaceful nuclear program? Are its declarations complete? And that by boring more deeply into that, and it can be done simply. It can just be that IAEA expects answers at 2 sites that have undeclared uranium. If the Iranians don't satisfy the IAEA, the US doesn't drop the sanctions. I mean, so you could tie together the JCPOA with the inspection effort of the IAEA. And if Iran is willing to concede and open up and tell the inspectors what happened at those sites, why is there undeclared uranium? Where is it now? Is there other undeclared uranium? Then I think you could then proceed, and that could compensate for the knowledge gained by Iran that's in clear violation of the JCPOA.
I mean, it sounds like what you're saying, beyond our previous discussion over the archive, demonstrates they've been in, violation of not only JCPOA but the NPT, in some ways even more importantly, for a while. But in order to get back to that status quo ante, either they will have to destroy things, or they will have to allow better and deeper and more frequent and greater inspections and verifications, or C, the United States will have to let some sanctions remain. And so any of those, or any combination of those, to me sounds like whatever, if anything, does emerge, for it to be, even moderately the same as what before, it cannot actually be the JCPOA as it was written. Am I understanding what you're saying?
That's right.
Right?
I mean, that's right. And that's the other side that you raised, is that it's not possible to go back to the JCPOA any longer. And so how is it going to look? The risk is that they just end up with a weaker JCPOA and they don't compensate. And they reduce all the sanctions. And then they say, look, Iran, we want to now make it longer and stronger, but they don't exactly have much leverage to do that. And clearly Iran has said it's not going to make it longer, stronger. And I think every day of their existence, they think of ways to make it weaker and shorter. And that's what they've been doing the last 2 years. So I think the United States needs to be pretty strong in insisting that there's clear compensation for Iran's non-compliance. And again, I think keeping sanctions in place, critical, it'd have to be key ones, could be one method. Iran's not going to accept that. Nonetheless, it could be the US position. The other is to move forward on insisting that Iran become more transparent about, and ultimately it's about its nuclear weaponization activities. I mean, that's what the inspections are really getting at. The JCPOA does a pretty good job of monitoring nuclear material and ensuring there isn't some secret enrichment site and things like that. But it does a very poor job on the nuclear weaponization pillar, and the stronger IAEA inspections that are in line with just what the IAEA is asking to do could provide much more confidence and compensation for these violations by Iran.
But it sounds like, just to put the fine point on it, sounds like what you're saying is that the administration and to some degree the press are saying, if there is an agreement, which is an if, it will either be the same as what it was, or actually better, or lead to something better. But what you're actually saying is that if there is an agreement, it will be the same or worse, that the better isn't really on the table.
I think, yeah, no, that's right. And I would say it won't be the same. I mean, you can't eliminate the Iranian knowledge. I mentioned earlier, we think at my institute, they're practicing breakout. I mean, that's what they're doing by making 60% enriched uranium. They have no civil need for it. They're just learning to go to higher enrichments. I mean, you could actually make a nuclear weapon with 60% enriched uranium of the type Iran designed. It has very robust design teams. Excuse me, it could modify its design with weapon grade, which is 90%, to work at 60%. It'd be bigger, but it would work. And if it was a test device or delivered crudely by truck or something, plane, ship, I mean, it could work. And so, but it doesn't make very much, but it sure, I think, is practicing how to get up to 90% faster, more reliably, without losing material, practicing, people getting valuable experience running these cascades in that mode. And I don't see how that disappears. I mean, it's there. And they weren't supposed to have this experience under the JCPOA until at least 2015. So I think we're going to end up with a weaker deal if the goal is just to reestablish the limits of the JCPOA. That, yeah, you can, and it may be weaker in very solid ways or very substantial ways, like if they don't destroy the IR6 centrifuges that have been deployed and the other advanced centrifuges that are in violation of the JCPOA. If those are just mothballed, then Iran's had a tangible gain from its violations that it weakens. That means a weaker JCPOA.
So we'll turn to questions in 1 minute. And so, like I said, if you have questions, please submit them through the Q&A function. I want to, in my last set of questions, focus on one particular aspect or kind of chain reaction or impact, let's say, not only to the archive, to the Iranian program, really the subject of your book, and to our response to it, which is what impact this is having on the non-proliferation regime. Let's say that, in many ways has existed for, 75 years in a lot of ways. So, the first question for you is, given what the Israelis not only identified, but brought to the fore, what does that say about the IAEA in general, and then in particular about, our collective sort of intelligence inspection and verification regimes? I mean, if we've established that it's impossible to actually trust the Iranians at their word, given their history, as you detail in the book, that they are historically a cheater and must rely on inspections, what does it mean that it's the Israelis and not the IAEA that found this?
Well, one is the IAEA, if Iran cooperates, which means the member states uniformly have to support the IAEA. I mean, Iran does give into pressure. They can do a tremendous amount. If the powers that be back away, don't support them, I think the non-proliferation regime will be damaged. I mean, here you have a case, the IAEA is raising alarm. There's undeclared nuclear material. There's good chance, well, not a good chance. Certainly there was a nuclear weapons in the past, and we can't tell you it's not going on today, and nothing happens. Well, that's a good sign, I'm being sarcastic, to Saudi Arabia. Go for it. Even I think UAE was going to look askance. Other countries could potentially start to reevaluate, because it'll be the IAEA is powerless to stop us. And so I think the world's experiencing a test now. Does it want peaceful verification in an international agency that has meaning, or is it going to be weakened and lose a lot of its credibility?
And in your mind, and obviously some of this is classified, so we might not have access to it, but what impact has this episode, the sort of, the Israelis found something that, the member states of the UN, of the IAEA, either didn't want to see or didn't push too hard on. As you said, the governments, for the most part, have not really taken in the full impact of what was discovered. What impact has this episode, in your mind, had on other, secret or, now that we know about it, but proliferators, whether that is North Korea, especially ones we're really concerned about, right? We can have a discussion over Saudi and UAE fit in that same category, but especially North Korea, or Pakistan or Syria, before the Israelis did what they did 15 years ago. Have you noticed kind of other regimes kind of taking lessons from this episode and either changing their behavior so as to, take advantage, let's say, of some of the, to your point, the damage or the weakness behind it?
Well, I think in the case of North Korea, they never liked the IA. I mean, they're very hostile to the internet, to the IA. Just it's historical, partly because the IA caught him cheating and sounded the alarm, and the world responded. And North Korea's never forgiven the IA for being so effective, and and this goes back to 1992 and 1993. But what's happening now with the IA in Iran would signal to North Korea that they don't have to worry about the IAEA. I mean, all you have to do is keep denying everything. The world will give in. And so any efforts to do denuclearization in North Korea are more complicated now and probably are going to require a different kind of verification or inspection effort, and that you won't be able to depend on the IAEA in the same way. So I think it's a blow there. Pakistan is almost a lost cause. I mean, where I would worry there is that is Pakistan going to help Saudi Arabia help its nuclear program? And I would think it wouldn't help them covertly in terms of providing nuclear weapons. I mean, the assistance I would worry about is that it would be safeguarded, a safeguarded enrichment plant sold by Pakistan to Saudi Arabia. And that given how this is played out or is playing out in Iran, who would legitimately have an argument to deny Saudi Arabia an enrichment plan, given that it's being accepted in a country like Iran that cheats and defies the International Atomic Energy Agency successfully? So I think there's going to be many consequences if the IAEA isn't supported to do its job correctly, and they're not good.
Clearly an optimistic take on what's going on. That was great. Well, let me go.
We always see the kind of the glass half empty. I mean, it's just a philosophical approach, which we found.
It probably comes with the territory. So that's great. All right. Well, let me go to questions. And like I said, I will unmute you so you can ask your question verbally. And please just identify yourself for David's question. So over to you, Gabe Noronha. I'm allowing you to talk. The power that Zoom gives me.
Thanks, Gabe. Hi, David. Gabriel Noronha. I used to work at the State Department Iran Action Group, so have lots of questions. Always appreciated your work. One note that you've sort of discussed a lot here is sort of that if Iran pursued a nuclear weapons breakout, but it has not currently made that determination. The State Department said as much back in April. Why do you think that's the case? And what do you think would be the elements that would change Iran's strategic thinking and propel it to pursue a nuclear weapon in that breakout?
Yeah, I think I agree. I think they see breakout as too risky right now. And I think when we've monitored discussions among Iranians on TV, this particularly after Mohsen Fakhrizadeh was killed, and there was quite a lot of open discussion. It's a bit hidden, but still what you can gather from it is at least members of parliament, we would interpret as in breakout terminology as they'd like to have a breakout of about 1 month or so, maybe even a little less, because they think that'll scare the West and leverage concessions. So I would argue that we can live with a shorter breakout timeline so long as we're negotiating and making progress. Where I worry things could become problematic is if Iran perceived that, one, there's just no punishment for building nuclear weapons, or they perceived that no matter what they did, they're going to be punished. So I think it's kind of two opposites, but if Iran feels that it has nothing, it can get away with it, which right now is unlikely given Israel. But again, what is the Biden administration? Are they willing to strike Iran militarily? And a breakout, I think, will not be so obvious in the initial phases. I mean, the inspectors will be denied access. There'll be reasons. It could, we've already seen some of that. Israel apparently attacked the underground Natanz site, crippled a bunch of centrifuges with an explosion by taking out the electrical supply. And so now inspectors shouldn't be allowed in for a while. And so I think we may not understand a breakout's going on initially. But I think they'd have to feel they can get away with it because eventually it'd be discovered. The other is they just don't care anymore. They feel that no matter what they do, they're going to be punished. I mean, we saw this in South Africa in the 70s, where they, in a sense, just said, what the hell? You want us to give up our nuclear weapons program, join the NPT, and give up apartheid. I mean, we're not going to do both. And now you're going to sanction us. So why don't we just build nuclear weapons anyway? And they proceeded to do that in great secrecy. And so Iran may implement a sneak out strategy at some point if it feels that no matter what, there's not going to be anything but military actions and sanctions.
Great. Professor Stephen David, over to you.
Thank you very much for your insightful analysis. I'm a professor at Johns Hopkins University and would like to ask, what do you feel the red line is for Israel to launch a military strike? I'm not talking about sabotage so much, but an airstrike. If they do, how likely would it be to be successful? And also, what is the connection with the conclusion with the Iran nuclear deal? Would the conclusion of a weak Iran nuclear deal be more of an incitement for Israel to launch an attack? Or would the fact that diplomacy is given a chance be a constraint?
Well, it's hard to predict with the new administration in Israel, but from what I understand, I mean, it really is different than we used to think. It's either negotiations and a deal or war. I mean, the Israelis have charted a third way, and that involves these military strikes. And I think in their mind, a JCPOA and weak inspections is weak inspections of military sites. The JCPOA has robust inspection of declared sites. Let me make that clear. But of military sites, they're weak. If that's the case, then I think they'll continue this third way. The dilemma they face is that Iran responds. They bombed or blew up, who knows how it happened, a centrifuge assembly facility at Natanz. Really destroyed it. It was a gem in the eye of the Iranians. I mean, it was to assemble advanced centrifuges by the thousands, and they've been building it, and it actually completed it under the JCPOA and hadn't operated it, and the Israelis destroyed it. Well, their response was, okay, now we're going to build one under a mountain, nearby mountain. And so if you want to destroy that, it's a larger military operation. And that's what the Israelis will be facing, that they can take out the low-hanging fruit, then it gets harder to do it, and they need a stronger military action. And pretty soon it starts to look like war. And so I think that's their dilemma. So I think they don't have red lines per se, but it just gets harder and harder for them to take out the key or let's say critical nodes that set Iran back on its effort to get nuclear weapons. And they also, I think this is assessments that have been done over the years, is that they can, if there is going to be a full strike and they just decide to take out a lot of the infrastructure, take out the Fordow enrichment plant, take out Natanz, they can do it once. And then Iran can rebuild and you're back to where you started from, but you probably have a program that's deeply buried and very much of it is secret. And they probably are committed to building nuclear weapons. So the only one who can really take it out militarily is the US. And that would require repeated strikes every 6 months. I'm being facetious, but not completely. They'd have to be able to go back and take out the stuff that's being built again or punish them in some other ways militarily. So I think that the military option ultimately isn't by any means desirable. And so you're forced back to developing pressure and negotiations. And I would argue the sooner you do all that, the better. I would argue that it's better to try to solve this thing now. In a way, Trump has offered an opportunity to settle this now. Whether the US can take that opportunity and succeed, I don't know, or even is willing. Iran will be tough to convince, but pressure, I think, can change their mind.
Let's go to Raymond Termini.
Yes, thank you. Did the archives reflect any assistance given to Iran from North Korea with respect to the nuclear development and the missile development?
Yeah, the archive has very little on ballistic missiles. I mean, it has information on the reentry vehicle. So the putting of a warhead into a reentry vehicle that's mounted on a missile, but very little on the missile. It was just posited that it'll be the Shahid 3. That's what you see in the archive. And media have uncovered nuclear cooperation between Iran and North Korea on nuclear weapon related codes, data. This goes back a decade, but the archive itself doesn't have that information. There is information in the archive very strongly indicating that ex-Soviet nuclear weapons experts helped Iran's nuclear weapons program. One is well known publicly, at least in the field, a Ukrainian actually who worked in the nuclear weapons production complex and helped them design capabilities to test nuclear weapons components and to design an initiation system of a nuclear weapon and test that system that's quite innovative and allows for miniaturization. And we were unable to discover other names. The Israelis refused to give them to us, but they say that they identified other ex-Soviets that contributed. We know that they went overseas to get help on learning how to tunnel the Imad plan. So the nuclear people went overseas, facilitated by the Quds Force. The Israelis redacted the name of the country in asking. They made it clear it wasn't North Korea where they went, but where was it? Maybe it was Lebanon, maybe Syria, I don't know. Lebanon with Hezbollah was very much into tunneling, and that may be where they went. So I think, and then if you get into the broader area of equipment, they went everywhere. They got the MOD program did a lot of procurement in Russia, Europe, China, particularly more the Atomic Energy Organization, but China there. And they bought anything they needed, and they needed a lot. And they continue that, in fact. They still need to buy things internationally, and they go out and do so illegally. In fact, if you follow this hostage situation where the Iranians seize hostages, Americans or dual national Americans or British, they're seeking to trade those people for the Iranian agents that go out and buy things illegally for them. So that in a sense, they're grabbing innocent hostages to be able to get back the people who have gone out and deliberately broken Western laws to acquire equipment that's banned for them to buy under those nations' laws and UN Security Council resolutions.
I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to take the prerogative and sort of ask you the last question, which is sort of a future casting question, which is the Iranian programming is continuing apace. We're obviously in these negotiations, which to those who know better than I seem to have a make or break element to them sometime in the next month or two or so. So there's a couple different clocks, it seems like. What in your mind, what would you recommend that we look for to kind of understand whether we're actually going to have a more restrictive or impactful or fix some of the JCPOA issues? What are the one or two elements that you look for, or discussions or terms or things that you see happening that would give you, let's say, to try and end in an optimistic way, but would give you more confidence, let's say, that that there are going to be more serious constraints on various aspects of their program?
Yeah, and again, I have to look for that. I mean, I would say I would be encouraged if Iran started to substantively answer the IAEA's questions about the undeclared nuclear material and these undeclared sites. I mean, they may not, maybe too late for them to admit to a full-blown nuclear weapons program in the past, and they'll certainly deny it in the present, but they may open up enough so that the IAEA can start to figure out what's going on today. If they don't do that, I would say that's a bad sign. I would look to see our centrifuge is going to be destroyed. I mean, I don't think it's enough to remove piping I think it's just, will centrifuges that are banned under the JCPOA at this point in time actually being destroyed? Will the United States be able to hold back a set of sanctions, nuclear sanctions, or at least it's diplomacy. It'll be sanctions that Iran would say are nuclear, but the US would say are something else. But nonetheless, hold back enough sanctions so that a second step could potentially be possible to strengthen and lengthen the deal. And so and there'd be other things too. I mean, what's going to happen with the whole system that was making uranium metal? How is that going to be resolved? Is Iran going to allow more intrusive inspections over aspects of uranium metallurgy in Iran, which they've resisted? And is it going to open up? Is there going to be more emphasis on Section T, this section that bans nuclear weaponization work? Will there be, a commitment by Iran and the P5+1 negotiators that will be verified? That there's certainly equipment covered by Section T that exists in Iran that's probably being used, and under Section T that has to be declared and monitored, and neither has happened so far. So will that happen? So I think there'll be plenty of indicators. I mean, again, it's all technical, and thank you for focusing on that side rather than on the sanction side. Appreciate that, because it isn't discussed enough in public. And then again, the last thing would be, is the deal public? Will we actually see what's agreed? I mean, one of the surprises to us in 2015 was there were secret aspects, and we had to ferret them out. I'll be honest. I mean, we used the tools that we know how to use. We don't use leaks, but the world is a complicated place and rules vary in countries. We found a couple secret aspects of the deal that really needed to be made public, that were being kept secret, and change your perception of the deal and its strengths once these things become public. So will the deal that the Biden team negotiates, will it be fully made public and revealed so we can all look at it?
Well, David Albright, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for your time. Thanks for enlightening us on a like I said, a really complex and in many ways scary situation. I urge everybody to read the book, Iran's Perilous Pursuit of Nuclear Weapons. You can find it on Amazon. And in general, I hope that whether this event or the book itself leads you to continue to follow David and the rest of the good ISIS's work on these issues. I think you'll find a really welcome, educational, and hopefully policy impactful organization. So David, thank you so much for everything that you do.
Thank you.
Great. Have a great afternoon, everybody.